But now I'm in a good spot because I've got this team of leaders that are completely independent and things are happening all around me. And all I have to do is listen to the report at the end of the month and say, great.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the Lead Entrepreneurs podcast. I'm your host, Joel Cabrera. Today we have Shannon from Integrity Environmental. Super excited. We just met actually, so this is gonna be a cool getting to know each other and then just jumping into all the entrepreneurial stuff. So Shannon, I would love to hear about who you are and some of your background, maybe even the origin story of the business and all of that. I think that'd be fun.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on. My name's Shannon Oelkers, and I am the owner and founder of Integrity Environmental. We are based in Alaska, although we do serve the Pacific Northwest as well. And the business that I own is an environmental consulting firm that specializes in bulk fuel storage. So we do all the environmental permitting and consulting related to bulk fuel storage, which, as you can imagine, in Alaska is a pretty big sector. Um, and I got into this strange niche sort of by accident. I sort of backed my way into it. I actually have a biology degree, but when I graduated in the mid '90s, there or late '90s, I guess, there was not a whole lot of jobs for biologists. There was a lot of competition for every position, and so I started working in rural Alaska with adult education, and I actually worked for the Girl Scouts for a while, which was super fun in really remote locations in Alaska. So I kind of fell in love with rural Alaska and the people there and the culture. And eventually, I got a job in environmental permitting because, as you know, in the grand scheme of things, Exxon Valdez was in 89, 90. And by the time 2000 rolled around, there was a much bigger environmental um, job market at that point. So I actually worked for the state of Alaska for a while. But my origin story begins in 2008 with a cancer diagnosis. I had a tumor and it was in my lung, but not related to cancer, and it almost killed me. And once I got through the other side of surviving that, the doctor said, "We don't know a lot about this cancer. You could have 5 years, you could have 50. We don't know." And given that, like, information, it really changed my worldview. And at the time, I was working for a big bureaucratic enterprise, the state of Alaska. And no shade, it was a great place to work, but it was cubes every day. I had to commute in, which was not wonderful. And so I really started looking at my life very seriously about how I wanted to work and who I wanted to work with. And I sort of created a whole new life. And by 2010, I went into business for myself and created this consultancy. And my original idea, because I also had kids after this cancer diagnosis, was that I wanted a position that would allow for me to have a family and still be home for quite a bit of it without commuting an hour and a half of my life away every day. Um, in 2010, that was pretty forward thinking. Like Zoom had not been invented until late in 2010. So I was doing it all by phone originally, but since COVID, that's been less of my origin story because people are like, oh, yeah, fully remote workplace. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm like, well, yeah, but I did it a long time ago. And we've sort of grown from my original hanging out the shingle as a consultant in 2010. Now we're a seven-figure firm that operates in Alaska and the North Pacific Northwest, and we have anywhere from 10 to 15 employees, depending on the season.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I think that's awesome that how you've overcome those, obstacles and challenges in your life and you turned that into a massive success. So major kudos to you. I think that's like honestly awesome. Um cool. Well, I mean, thanks for sharing all of that. I mean, I think that in itself was like extremely powerful and inspiring, I would say probably to lots of people out there. Um I mean, bulk fuel storage. Very niche. And I don't know how. Yeah, so I understand the journey. You got the degree, then you went into like I would say the public sector, right? And even working with Girl Scouts. But where was the bulk storage? Where did that specifically come from? Yeah, yeah.
Sure. So I was originally hired at the state to work with contaminated sites. And a lot of contaminated sites in Alaska are the result of fuel spills, not just the Exxon Valdez, of course, but other spills from just operating. I was asked by there's a division of the state that regulates bulk fuel facilities, and I had a lot of experience in rural Alaska, and I have a pretty good personality for it. I'm very open and interested, and they actually recruited me to go work in their department. So I didn't know anything about tanks, but I knew a whole lot about fate and transport of contaminants and how to work with contaminated soils. And so when I first went to terminals and tank farms, which is the division that recruited me, I had to learn a lot about tanks, and they seem really simple. I'm sure everyone listening to this has seen a big white tank at a port that looks like an overgrown Campbell's soup can that's holding fuel, right? But those tanks are machines, and there's a lot of hydrology that goes into, how fluid moves into and out of a tank, how the tank is maintained. And in Alaska, we have older infrastructure. Some of our tanks are over 100 years old. They were built during the logging days in Southeast Alaska, and they've been well maintained. And the steel is still good, just like the L steel in Chicago is still good. Over 100 years old, but it's still there, right? And then other parts of our state, we had like lesser quality steel tanks installed in like the 80s after the Trans Alaska Pipeline. And those are in worse shape. So we have some significantly aging infrastructure, and aging tanks leak more frequently because they're older and they have corrosion. And if they're not well maintained, that accelerates the process. And so there was just a lot of opportunity for us to become specialized in it. And so um, it sort of leads into our value proposition, which is that it's hard to regulate, or it's hard to be working at an industry that stores bulk fuel and meet all of the environmental permitting requirements that go with it. There's spill response, there's spill prevention, there's operations and maintenance, there's the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. And so, what our firm did is we became a fractional environmental management group. So, if you are somebody who stores bulk fuel and there's a permit that renews once every 5 years and it's a huge permit, hiring us to do that once every 5 years makes more sense than hiring a person for that 1 year or having somebody on board for 5 years just for when you need to renew it. And so we do a whole spectrum of things, but our unique proposition is that we put ourselves in the seat of the person sitting at the tank farm. So that terminal manager or facility manager, he has to do all the environmental permitting for every single one of his tanks. He has to do all the record keeping. He has to meet all those permits. And that person needs support in the form of training, permit writing, and record keeping review, and like all that stuff to make it easier because it's hard. There's a lot of it. Um, and a lot of it doesn't necessarily make common sense, right? Like the regulation says this shall happen, and common sense says you wouldn't do that, but you still have to write it down and make sure that it's documented. So that was where we became really successful. Originally, I think, like many of your listeners, I tried to do everything anyone asked me just to get money in through the door. But once we really started focusing on the bulk fuel storage, we were able to completely saturate the bulk fuel storage market in Alaska. And then we started adding other verticals. So we now work with utilities who have fuel backups for electrical generation. And then we also work with fish processors because they're typically really remote locations and they generate their own electrical and they have their own fuel storage needs for refrigeration and power and all these things. And then lately, we've also started working with different sectors that do industrial type work like boat and ship repair or hazardous materials management. And they're still storing fuel in bulk as part of the other things that they do.
That is fascinating. Okay. Yeah, that's very niche.
Mhm.
I think it's fascinating just learning about, I guess honestly, just all the different types of businesses that you could
Yeah.
make, right?
I never dreamed
Oh,
as a little girl of growing up and running around a tank farm. Like I, I had no idea. Um, but related to like the purpose, what I really like about bulk fuels is we are helping people keep fuel where it belongs. We're not reacting to the spill after the fact and cleaning up after a spill. We're working really hard to identify risks for spills and eliminate them up ahead of time. And that's the part that I really feel is our why. Like we also want to help people do a good job, and I love that people who transport fuel are the most caring and considerate and careful group of people because they have to take all these licenses and training to be able to transport hazardous materials and fuel. And they know that if they screw up and go around the corner too fast, the truck's going to roll and that fuel's going to come out. And they know that if they don't pay attention to the tank, it could overfill and spill and enter a waterway. Like, they're very conscientious, and helping people do that job better is really internally satisfying for me. I feel really good about.
Yeah, I mean, wow. Okay, I would say that's I don't know, I personally think that's all fascinating because I don't know. I guess the average person wouldn't even think about all of these things, and
Mm-mm.
it's interesting to
It's an
see there's a
invisible
whole
industry.
yeah. It's like
Invisible.
yeah, it's like there's a whole industry behind. So like it's like every time I see a fuel tank right now, I'm gonna think of this conversation. So that's pretty awesome. I guess maybe even to pivot, just keeping it a bit broader, maybe here. What have been some of the maybe your challenges or lessons learned along the journey of just even starting this and getting maybe even some of these contracts or that moment when you realize, hey, maybe this is a specific area where we need to focus on. What did those kind of stories look like?
Well, I've had like two challenges as the owner of the business. The first was transitioning from, uh, for I would say, let's see, for 7 years. So from 2010 to 2017, my business model was that I did all of the planning and permit writing. I was the main producer and I had helpers. I had people that would help me do technical editing or billing, but I was producing most of the work. In 2017, however, I realized, I mean, I was turning away hundreds of thousands of dollars every year in work to just because I was like, I can only take this much. And so in 2017, I thought, you know what? I'm going to go for it. I'm going to see if I can build a team and train them and see if I can transition from me doing all the work to us having a bigger company because I was kind of maxed out at $500,000. I couldn't do any more work and I was working all the time and I had little kids and I was like, this is not what I signed up for. So I was like that little fish in the tank. I grew up to the size of the tank and then I was like, oh, there's not enough room to swim anymore. So in 2017, I invested in a bigger tank. I hired, I think, 6 people that year. And that was really scary because I only had cash reserves. I didn't have a bank loan or access to SBA money because I was a services business. There's not really, I don't have assets to buy or product to invest in. It's just brains, right? And so in 2017, we started building a bigger company. And for 2 years, I thought I was doing really well. And then I did take an SBA course. It's called something else now, but at the time it was called Emerging Leaders. And it was like a 6 month intensive MBA, like a little mini MBA course. And I was in this group with, I think, 25 other people. And I got to the end of it and they measured all the metrics in our business. And I crunched all the data and I learned a whole lot about business because I'm a scientist. I didn't know. And I remember at the end of the program, like there's 25 of us, 24 people in that were like, oh, I'm a great business person. Everything's going good. And I, at the end, was like, oh my Lord, I have so much work to do. I don't have any systems in place. I don't have any of the things that I was supposed to have. Getting the metrics was a huge pain in my patush. There's all this stuff that I was all of a sudden aware of needed to happen if I was going to grow past maybe 750. Like I hired all these people. It was really expensive and then I I was still bottlenecking everything. And so after 2019, I began reading a business book a week. I read 52 or more business books a year. And I started knocking out systems. So we started with standard operating procedures and training new hires. And that's the second part of my business. But the hardest thing for me, and I will share this because I think other entrepreneurs need to hear it, is the forecasting of work in a services business is very difficult to do. And it took me almost 3 years of learning and a professional consultant to help us get our timesheet timesheet entries correct for billable, get our services broken down into the correct way to bill things, and then to create spreadsheets and systems to project work as it's approved. And we had to create these systems and then gather data and then get the data from past work to predict future work. I mean, in 2022, I could not tell you how many hours it took us on average to do any of our services. I had a guess, but I didn't know. Now I know within 2 decimal points, 37.25 for SPCCs. We know that's the average. And we update that number every year based on past performance of the past 3 years. And using that, we were able to then break down each task and push it forward into a projection, because our services last anywhere from 6 weeks to 9 months, and it's very difficult to project future work um, in that manner. Other people sell a widget, they get the project or they get the order, they send it out the door, and the entire cycle takes 3 days or whatever. That's a very easy way to predict your future revenue because you've got orders coming in, but we don't have anything like that. So that was very difficult. And then what I'm chewing on now that is difficult is I am still leading the sales team. I'm the founder. And I've sold for all 15 years that we've been in business. And now I'm in this seat where I have to adjust and start learning more. I've been learning about sales for 2 years straight, and I just hired what do we call it, a sales support administrator, and then she is helping me work on creating sales systems for some of our smaller items that I think will be easier to train somebody to sell. And I'm still wrestling with how to get off that loop to where I'm maybe not as involved in sales. Because it's if I screw it up, it's the lifeblood of the company, right? So that's why it's the last one.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That was a journey right there. Interesting. Fascinating. I mean, so and I would probably ask where you're at right now. You know, I guess even outside of sales and being a sales leader, um, where do you see, you know, do you feel like you have everything else in place, you know, regarding leadership and team? Or how about maybe we could pivot into what have been some of your, you know, major lessons, you know, regarding leadership and team, you know, especially being in the business for so long. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I learned the hard way that hiring the right people is incredibly important. And it took me about 5 years to get comfortable with exiting people quickly when they are not a cultural fit. Um, because um, I am a person that fundamentally believes that every person should have the opportunity to get better, achieve more, change their life. I'm a huge outside the box thinker, clearly. I mean, I had cancer. My first thought was like, I got to create a whole job for myself that doesn't involve a cubicle. And so when I see people struggling or they're not a cultural fit, I want to give them that chance to modify how they're thinking, to adjust, to fit in, to gain the skills that they need. But it took the hardest lesson I learned was the longer I give somebody that runway, the harder the rest of my team is working to accommodate where that other person's letting them down. And we use this all the time internally. We're from Alaska, right? The Iditarod's about to start, and dog mushing is a huge part of our culture. And what I say is, I'm the musher. I've got all these bright, powerful minds pulling my sled. And if one of those huskies is sleeping or dragging or not running or running in the opposite direction or to the side, the whole team is affected. We cannot go forward. We cannot go fast. We cannot be nimble. And that was a big lesson for me was I have to have good leadership. I have to have people who are executive level thinkers on my leadership team. They have to not only identify the problem but bring solutions and have either made the decision about what the solution is going to be and have that be in line with our values and culture. um, because if they don't have that, then I'm still really doing the job. I have to go in and make the decision. I have to go in and bring the cultural value. And so once I figured that lesson out, it took me about 18 months to get a leadership team in place that was better than me in every way. And that was also another hard lesson that I had to swallow. Literally, every member of my leadership team is smarter, more focused. They have skills that I lack. I still have the big vision, and I think that's probably going to be my strength for the long term. But, hiring somebody to do things that you did not as great and watching them sprint ahead of you and do an amazing job, I mean, that is a little bit of an ego funk when it happens. But now I'm in a good spot because I've got this team of leaders that are completely independent and things are happening all around me. And all I have to do is listen to the report at the end of the month and say, great, where do we want to go next? And maybe give a little nudge if I think they're too far to the left, push them to the right or whatever, which is sustainable and scalable. I couldn't do it before when I was making all the decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's awesome that you've gotten to that point as well. I think that's something that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with. in general, just finding the right team, let alone finding the right executive team to help make some of those more crucial decisions. Um, yeah,
We do invest heavily in our hiring. Our interview questions are very well written, and our culture is woven throughout it. And we also ask really not odd questions, but in depth questions. And then we might ask a few questions in different ways to kind of, like, for example, one of our questions, we say, tell us about a time that you did this. And they tell us, right? And then we know that's the canned answer that they practiced or looked up on Chat GPT before they came. But then we'll say, can you tell us about another time? And we ask them for a second example. And that's off the cuff. And that's where the wheels come off the bus if they don't have the right cultural fit or background that we're looking for. That second answer is a lot less polished and allows us to get to the heart of who that person is. And we don't necessarily want someone to be, perfect, but we do want them to have the right approach, the right thought process to some of the problems that we have to solve that kind of lines up with our culture.
yeah, that's actually a good, I guess, little trick for people to start doing in the interview process. That's interesting. Okay, cool. And maybe as a another pivot here, where do you being in a very niche sub industry, right? I would probably even say, where do you see yourselves, in the future, 5, 10 years from now? Yeah.
Well, hopefully, I'll be on a podcast called The Eight Figure Entrepreneur. That's our goal. But I have to nail sales. That's what's keeping us in the eight digit or seven digits right now. Is I am bottlenecking everything again at sales. But once we get sales up, we also have two different lines of recurring revenue that are based on training and record keeping assistance. And so I'm hoping that that recurring revenue, pardon me, will be a significant portion of our revenue. Right now, I think it's at 5 to 8%, and I'd like to see it at maybe 10 or even 25 of our revenue as we grow. Um, because recurring revenue is really wonderful if you're a services business. It allows you to do things that uh, all the rest of our work is reoccurring. So it happens every 5 years or every 10 years when something's due or as changes happen at the facility, but it's not necessarily something that I can rely on to occur every single year. So we are hoping in 3 to 5 years to be a much bigger company. I'd like to be able to help other verticals and then also like right now, we only help utilities in Alaska, but I know for a fact that all over the Pacific Northwest, they also handle fuel oil and mineral oil in bulk quantities as well. And I feel like there's a lot of similar need. It's an underserved industry, and their primary job is to make electricity, not store fuel. So I do see like a lot of expansion into the Northwest and potentially Hawaii as well. Hawaii is very similar to Alaska in that they're very remote. All their fuel comes in on barges, and they have a massive electrical demand that strips out any renewable numbers because all the tourists. They just cannot meet the electric demand of Waikiki with solar and wind. I don't think, not yet, not with current technology.
Yeah, well, I believe in you. I think you got this. You got this in the bag. And I mean, thank you for everything. I think you definitely dropped a lot of gems. I would say for lots of entrepreneurs out there to pick up. And maybe where can people find you? Yeah,
Well, I'm really active on LinkedIn because all of our clients are in so many verticals and spread out so geographically, across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. So I'm on LinkedIn. It's Shannon Oelkers. And I travel extensively for my job and I'm a photographer. So if you really like beautiful Alaska photos, I would encourage you to connect with me and then you will get a never ending stream of gorgeous bear videos and aurora and all the beautiful things that Alaska has to offer.
that's cool. I like that. All right. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for taking some of your time and being on the podcast. We really appreciate it. I have no doubt that you're gonna keep soaring, to that 8 figure mark. You seem to have a really good head on your shoulders, so I can tell you got this. And thank you so much once again, and thank you all you guys for tuning in. Till next time, catch you on the flip side.
Thank you for having me and connecting. I really appreciate the opportunity.